Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us for this first of our events in the series Rethinking Iran in 2021 here at the Johns Hopkins SAIS. I am Vali Nasser. I'm a professor of Middle East Studies and International Affairs at Johns Hopkins SAIS, and I'm joined here today by my colleague, Professor Narges Bajogli, who is the Assistant Professor of Middle East Studies. And we're very excited to have our JHU colleague with us, Johns Hopkins colleague with us today, Professor Niloofar Haeri. Niloofar Haeri is a professor in the Department of Anthropology at Johns Hopkins University and is the program chair in Islamic Studies at the university. She is a linguist by training, and her first book was published in 1996, entitled The Sociolinguistic Market of Cairo, Gender, Class, and Education. Her second book on Egypt is an ethnography of the coexistence of Egyptian Arabic and Classical Arabic. It is also a study of modernization of Classical Arabic and poses the question, what is a modern language, and can a language be both sacred and modern at once? That book was published in 2003. Her latest book, about which she will be speaking with us today, is based on her research in Iran, for which she was awarded the John Simon Guggenheim Fellowship and the Martha Sutton Weeks Fellowship at the Stanford University Humanities Center. The book is entitled Say What Your Longing Heart Desires: Women, Prayer, and Poetry in Iran. And it was just published a few months ago by Stanford University Press. It is a book on ethnographic research in Iran among the educated middle-class women whose voices are often muted in the study of Islam and also in the study of the role of Islam in Iran. She follows her subjects in their daily lives as they engage in the study of classical poetry of Rumi, Hafez, Saadi, and in illuminating a long-standing mutual inspiration between prayer and poetry. It is a fascinating book. It has a fascinating approach to studying a modern society in Iran and the way in which it's evolved in the Islamic Republic, tying together different strands of middle-class sensibility together in the milieu of Iran. And I strongly recommend it to all of our audience. It is genuinely a innovative look at Iran today. Now, for today's session, Professor Haeri will give a short presentation on her book, and then that will be followed with a conversation between Professor Haeri and my colleague, Professor Narges Bajogli. And we also encourage all of our attendees to ask questions in the YouTube chat function or via our social media feeds. And we will pose them to Professor Haeri in the 1 hour time frame we have. So without further ado, I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Haeri to Johns Hopkins SAIS. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Vali and Narges, for this invitation. I'm very happy to be here and have a chance to talk to you about my book. As you said, I'm just going to do a presentation for about maybe 15 minutes, and then I look forward to our conversation. Let me begin by giving you a bit of background to my fieldwork in Tehran. As most researchers who work on Iran would agree, speaking about the country in the context of present-day US is not an easy task. There's a great deal of negative media about Iran, and when people hear about the country, images that come to mind are of scowling clerics, laboratories with centrifuges, and black-clad women covered from head to toe. Such images do capture certain realities in the country, but leave a great deal out. Part of what is left out is what I hope we can talk about today. In 2008, I was in the middle of a project comparing notions of modesty among Iranian Muslims, Jews, and Christians. But while doing this research, I noticed there is quite a bit of debate on questions of religion going on both in the media, in newspapers, television shows, and in people's homes. I became interested in following these debates because they addressed long-standing conundrums and disagreements about what is true Islam, who is a true Muslim, what do we want out of performing religious rituals, and how should we establish a relationship with the divine? So I left the research I was doing and began focusing on the debates. This, I think, was a productive way to get to understand what was going on in Iranian society. And in fact, now I tell my students that if you want to get to know a society from inside out, try to find out about their own debates rather than those that come primarily from the concerns of academics and their various disciplines. In any case, from 2008 to 2016, I carried out fieldwork in Tehran with a group of middle-class educated Muslim women, most of whom were born in the 1940s. Almost all of them had taught in public high schools, and by the time I met them, they were retired. The decision to focus on this group came from conversations that I chanced upon among older women who were regularly attending weekly Quran and poetry classes. I attended these classes and ended up meeting more and more women who were willing to talk to me about their ideas and practices as Muslims. In fact, while for most of my life I had not been particularly interested in matters of religion, I became increasingly drawn to the larger question of what it means to be religious in the first place. The revolution of 1979 ended the monarchy of the Pahlavi regime and forced the Shah out of Iran. An Islamic Republic was established after a controversial referendum that was carried out in March 1979. And before Iranians could catch their breaths about the implications of such momentous changes in their society, Saddam Hussein attacked Iran in September 1980, and the Iran-Iraq War began. This was a mutually devastating 8-year war, and we will never know what trajectory the revolution would have taken had the war not started so quickly after the revolution. After the war, as daily life found some stability, Iranian society turned toward itself. There was a reflexive turn, a renewed interest in the country's cultures, history, religion, literature, music, and so on. For that reason, and as public places of entertainment got increasingly curtailed, a whole slew of informal classes were formed in people's homes and in neighborhood cultural centers. As I just mentioned, I began meeting women in Quran and poetry classes, and I first began to ask them questions about the ritual prayer in Islam called namaz in Persian and salat in Arabic. This is the first subject that interested me. The obligatoriness of this prayer and the fact that it centrally defines being a Muslim has made its performance enter the high-stakes debates on what it means to be religious. Discussions in such classes were prime examples of the reflexive moment I just mentioned. And in fact, it seemed to me that there was a sort of ongoing mass education in theology that was taking place. In print media, television, radio, and websites and gatherings, there was this question on the table: what is true Islam? Who is a true Muslim? What kind of Islam should Iranians strive for? What are the ethics of being a Muslim? Because after the revolution, Iranians ended up with an Islamic republic that wanted to tell people, and often coercively so, the correct way to be a Muslim in all ways, from what one wore to what one drank, how prayers were to be performed, the question of Islam moved into the public sphere. Now, in the last few decades, we have been reading and hearing from those in the media, as well as in academia, that the revolution in Iran has been an utter failure, that it took Iranian society backward instead of forward toward enlightenment and progress. Again, it is not that some of these kinds of characterizations are entirely false. It is that they prevent us from discovering changes that were set in motion that are crucial in understanding contemporary Iran. So I urge in my book that we avoid looking at revolutions and uprisings in terms of either success or failure. This enables us to be open, and that's really crucial, to discovering unexpected developments that no one really had planned. It would also allow us to see things can happen in societies for which we do not have any ready-made frames, names, or theorization. What the revolution brought forth, along with increases in literacy, availability of sources, informal classes, is that non-elite people, the laity, historically called the awam, as opposed to the khawas in Muslim societies, entered the debate about true Islam. In fact, the revolution helped blur this boundary and greatly decreased its historical starkness. Among the many questions that were being debated was one that continues to receive endless attention and is articulated in a variety of ways. For example, what is the status of any religious act if it is not done with sincerity, khulus, and what is called presence of the heart, huzur qalb? What good is it to pray and fast if one then goes on to lie and cheat? What is the relative worth of a religious act that might be legally valid from the point of view of Islamic jurisprudence, but does not bring about any connection between the performer and the divine? Should clerics mediate the relationship between individuals and the divine? What is interesting about these and similar questions is that they're not new. They have been with Muslims for centuries. But what happened is that the revolution greatly increased the stakes of the particular answers the state and various groups of citizens would give to such questions. The many impositions of state institutions could have resulted in an entirely polarized population, pro-regime, anti-regime, pro-Islam, anti-Islam. But what happened is that across class and gender lines, many groups of people began to engage by going to classes, exchanging with others, and finding ways of forming their ideas about Islam. That is to say that they did not cede the grounds of religion to the state by washing their hands off of the whole matter. Of course, there was also disengagement and outright rejection. So I don't mean to imply that everyone participated in these kinds of explorations, but many did. And my interest is with the kinds of debates that they generated. In the summer of 2015, I did an interview with Mohammad Mujtahid Shabestari, one of the best known prolific and original thinkers among contemporary Muslim religious intellectuals, as they're called in Iran. And this is what he said. After the revolution, there was a lot of bughz. Bughz means pent-up anger, rancor. But religious ideas came to be hotly debated. The time has passed when they would bring some authority and he would say, this is the way things are, and that would be it. The heart of our society has many diverse ideas, even in traditional groups. People say, well, such and such Ayatollah has said what he has said, but that does not necessarily mean anything. End of quote. Now, we can ask, well, with what kinds of conceptual, terminological, and aesthetic resources did the laity, the awam, engage in these debates? The one that I describe in my book at some length is the vast body of mystic writing and poetry in Iran. There is a spectrum of familiarity with mystic or irfan poetry, from those who specialize in it to those like the women I talk to, who become familiar with irfan through poetry and songs. They may also read philosophers and theologians, but poetry really dominates in how they learn about mysticism. And often classes on poetry include discussions of irfan concepts when they interpret the lines. The poetry, significantly, is also taught at various levels of education in secondary schools and later on. So if you look at textbooks for Persian literature from about 1959, when my interlocutors in this study were in high school, to the 2000s are full of poems, including those of Rumi and Hafez. I realize that in English, when we say mysticism, it seems like something quite far from daily life, belonging to theologians and maybe some New Age followers. But in Iran, it is alive and present through a variety of means, and its poets continue to be relevant interlocutors. What I suggest in my book is that mystic poetry has been a companion to the world of prayer in the cultural history of Iran in the last many centuries. And that relationship exists also in the lives of many Iranians, including the women that I worked with. Classical poetry is viewed as a source of inexhaustible wisdom and knowledge that remains accessible to various degrees to non-specialists. Now, I'm going to shorten the rest of my talk so we can have more time for conversation, but I want to give just one example of how it is that that mystic poetry gets interwoven in the political and cultural life of Iran today. There is a very famous story in the Masnavi by Rumi, which is called Moses and the Shepherd. It's probably his most famous story. And I'm going to shorten it quite brutally so that we can save time. So Moses overhears the shepherd talking to someone, and the shepherd is saying, "Where are you, so I may take the lice from your hair, so I can sew you shoes, give you my goat's milk?" And Moses asks him, "Who are you talking to?" And the shepherd says, "I'm talking to our creator." Moses then scolds the shepherd and tells him to not talk to God like that. God is not your uncle. He's in no need of milk or shoes. The shepherd then becomes despondent upon hearing this and runs to the desert. God then sends a revelation to Moses. "You have separated me from one of my own. Did you come as a prophet to unite or to sever?" And God then goes on to remind Moses that the shepherd was in hal, and that is what matters. And hal is a major concept in mysticism that refers to a fleeting state where one is suddenly overwhelmed by an inexplicable and overwhelming joy, or it could be overwhelming sadness, where one feels for a moment the presence of the divine. So God says what matters is what's in his heart, not the kind of language he uses to talk to me. And then Moses runs after the shepherd and tells him, "Do not search for manners and rules. Say what your longing heart desires." Now, this was written in the 13th century. How does it become relevant today? In 2014, Moses and the Shepherd became a major flashpoint when a well-known supporter of the Republic, Hujjatul Islam Qaraati, who has his own television show and website, attacked Rumi for suggesting that the prophet should not intervene in the shepherd's relationship with God. He called Rumi an anti-prophet and went on to defend Moses against God. I quote him, "Prophets came in order to prevent such nonsense." In response, Ayatollah Younesi, who is the special advisor to the president for minority affairs, said, "Worship is the relationship of the individual to God. It does not matter in what language and style," and that's what Molavi, that is Rumi, was trying to say. So there were many reactions to this exchange. It was all over various websites. It was in the media. But you can see why this would be so relevant to contemporary Iran. Clerics, many clerics believe they must intervene and tell others how to be a Muslim. So this is what I mean by the continued sway of and relevance of mystic ideas. So I think what I'll do is I will stop my presentation here and hope to get a chance to talk at more length about prayer and poetry or any other topic that might be of interest. Thank you.
Thank you, Niloofar Jan, for the great presentation and also for the book. I really learned so much reading this, and do really recommend it for the viewers, because what I really appreciated about what you did with this book is not only do you take us, as you say within the book and also in your presentation, outside of or beyond this binary of pro-regime or anti-regime, and you show us the everyday realities in which people are trying to make sense of their lives, trying to make sense of all of these political and social upheavals that have happened in Iran over these past few decades. And you bring us to where a lot of these debates are happening. in the everydayness, and then show us how that has repercussions for these wider public debates around religion and around the role of religion in politics and in life. One of the things that I wanted you to talk a little bit more with us about is your emphasis on studying this particular generation of women. So what is it about this particular generation of women that you focus on in this book? Because I do think that, we don't actually have a lot of literature and scholarship and research focusing on this generation of women in Iran. So I want you to talk a little bit more about the importance of that. And also particularly, what is their significance in these debates around religion in the post-revolutionary sphere?
Sure. So this generation, as I mentioned, they were mostly born in the 1940s. And this is a generation that not only finished high school, but finished college, which was quite significant. Their mothers may have finished 9th grade, may have sometimes gotten a high school diploma, but rarely. So the fact that you have this generation of women who went to college and then became professionals. In other words, they ended up having a salary. They ended up becoming independent economically from their family and from anyone that they would marry. And in fact, as a historian of women in Iran has said, I think it's Kamran Amin, who said that the woman question became a debate rather than just accepting that women just stay home and tend to their family and children. So and then this generation ended up being teachers, nurses, even musicians. Their presence in the public may not have been great in terms of quantity, but qualitatively, it was very important that they were present. And they grew up, most of them grew up in religious families. What I mean by that when I say they grew up in religious families, because it needs some explanation, is that their parents prayed. But as in my family, which was a religious family, my parents prayed, but they also believed in the equality of men and women. They treated my brother and me, similarly. So they were religious. They self-identified as Muslim, but at the same time, they were quite open-minded about how they ought to raise their children. And so what they explained to me is that when the revolution happened, they became more interested in reflecting on religion rather than taking it for granted. And they ended up having gatherings. You can imagine Iranians have always been very interested in all kinds of gatherings, right? And in these gatherings, even before the revolution, it used to be that someone would read poetry, someone would bring up a passage they like from some book and so on. But it became much more of a practice that they would ask someone who, say, for example, would have some expertise in Rumi to come to these gatherings and do a more systematic study. So this reflection on religion is something that they talked about a lot, and they distinguished themselves most of the time. They distinguished themselves from their mothers, who they said had inherited religion.
One of the things that I think you do beautifully in this book is that you mentioned this, I think it's in your preface or your introduction, that you wrote it in a style that is available to students, to non-specialists, to educated readers, but not necessarily those who are steeped in the language or the particular, contemporary debates within an academic sphere. And you and so you try to bring these different realities to life in this way. And one of the, but yet you are making really interesting, and I think deep interventions in two different spheres. One is studies of Islamic studies, and the other is studies of post-revolutionary Iran. And in work on Islamic studies, you mentioned that you sort of take inspiration from Shahab Ahmad's book, his magnum opus, and trying to really take this question seriously of how Islam has been understood in English language, academia, and public culture. So I would love for you to talk a little bit more about that, but then also where you think your research and your book sort of opens up new pathways for us to understand post-revolutionary Iranian society. So both what it does for our understandings of Islam writ large, and also what it does for our understandings of all of the complex dynamism in Iran in this post-revolutionary sphere.
Thank you. As someone who was not actually trained in religious studies, when I became interested in learning more about how people study religion, what people say about Islam and so on, I noticed that there is a certain amount of preponderance of studies that pay particular attention to jurisprudence. One ends up with this idea that essentially, Muslims, wake up in the morning and say, what does Sharia tell me to do next? And then, sorry for the exaggeration, but basically it gets dominated, and you get an image of Muslims as this almost robotic, following what, Sharia, which by the way is a term that's not used in Iran in this sense, but what Sharia tells them to do. And what I really appreciated about Shahab Ahmad's book is that he calls these approaches to the study of Muslims as legal supremacists, where Muslims come across as being uniquely legalistic in their approach to religion. And what I wanted to show, and it's not that I actually set out to show what I said, this is the field work, right? And I realized that, for example, in so many of the conversations about doing the ritual prayer namaz, the question of what actually, Islamic jurisprudence says didn't regularly come up. It really mostly had to do with what do we want to get out of this practice, right? This practice, for example, can make you a better person, and so on. So I think it's very important to see religiosity, to first ask, what does it mean to be religious, whether in Islam or in other religions, but also to see how it plays out in daily life. Equally importantly, I think it's important not to see religion as something very bounded and very clear cut, because there are all kinds of worlds that enter, and religion enters those worlds, and those worlds enter religion. And one of them in Iran is poetry. The neighborliness or companionship of these two worlds is really crucial to understand the quality of the religiosity that one sees. As for new pathways, this is my first foray into the study of religion. So, but I think that, there are several things that are important. One of them is to ask and not take for granted what it means to be religious. I think that secular Iranians, as well as I would say seculars around the world, are a little bit too intolerant of people who are religious. They assume they know what it means for them to be religious, and so they're not really interested to discovering them. And so one of the things that one finds in writing about Iran is not only to get beyond the fact that Iran has this particularly negative image, but also that religion itself does and religiosity does, right? How can we go beyond these and be open to discovering the many different ways one can be religious, and how can we coexist, right?
And one of the discussions that you bring in your book is, and just the background, the political reality of the background of the creation of an Islamic Republic in this post-revolutionary sphere means that the state tries to create a certain kind of monopoly about what it means to be religious, even though actually there's so much discussion and debate among different clerics too, which I think often gets left out of public understanding. But regardless, there is this attempt by the state to create a monopoly of practices, ways of being pious, ways of dressing, and also just how Islam should be incorporated into different aspects of life. And what you show us here is that in some paradoxical ways has actually opened up the floodgates of public discussions and debates about then what does Islam mean. So if the clerical establishment or the state is saying certain things, it also then means that people then begin to question those things, or then to say, well, why should we take your word for it? Why not look into a different interpretation of this, or a different ways of, or different teachings even? And this is, I think, where I would love for you to start talking more about the poetry aspect of this. And, but yeah, I mean, in general, just to give our viewers a sense of these study circles and these different spaces in which you entered to do your research, and how you saw these kinds of discussions develop throughout this space, and some of the distinctions you make in your book and the ways you pay attention to when Arabic is used versus when Persian is used, versus the different kinds of ways of talking to God, and then also thinking about God in relation to oneself and in relation to society as a whole.
Sure. It's many things to be said. I'll try to be short. One of the eye-opening things for me in doing this field work was how often doctrine was not there. It was not a question, Islam says this, here's the doctrinal matter, you ought to pray in this way, or, the Prophet said this and that, or, it says in the Quran. Now, of course, people do talk about what is in the Quran, what's not, but it doesn't necessarily dominate. In fact, I became quite aware of this when I was asking the women to describe to me, whether they grew up with poetry or not, what were they reading, for example, when they were children, what were their parents teaching them? One of the things I asked was, what were you being taught by their parents about Islam, and so on. And what I discovered is that what they remembered were about 2 or 3 things they were said about Islam, that the Quran is a book that comes from God, it's from the heavens, it's a holy book, that God has not been born nor has given birth. This is one of 2 things, and that the Prophet Muhammad is the prophet of Muslims. They didn't remember very much more than that, right? What they remembered was how much the emphasis was put on them learning the namaz, the ritual prayer, right? Which has its own very interesting history about how people actually learn it, right? So that's one thing, doctrine doesn't play as huge a role in, formation of a religious subject as people outside of religion might think, right? There are so many other ways in which that happens. And so what happens is, from childhood, they are taught to memorize a few lines of poetry from Rumi, from Hafez, from this and that. And it becomes very important to understand that people's relationship with a text is built not necessarily on understanding the meaning of every single word. It also depends on who teaches them. So for example, a prayer or a poem becomes dear to you, not so much necessarily because of what it says, but because it was your father who taught you. It was your mother. It was some very, beloved uncle who taught you, right? So, right. I forgot what your question was, but
it's okay. So like so having moving away from the monopoly of the state and how
yes, right, exactly. So exactly. So here you have a state with a set of institutions that's trying to tell you this is how to be a Muslim. But also, as my example between Hujjatul Islam Qaraati and Ayatollah Yunasi shows, is that the state itself is not entirely monolithic, right? Because these are two people that have very close relationships to the state, but they have very different approaches to religion, right? As you can see in the way they react to Moses and the shepherd. Now, what happens is that here you have these women who who still continue to self-identify as Muslim. It must be said that they do encounter fairly often friends who give them a hard time about continuing to believe in Islam and continuing to self-identify as Muslim, but they stand very steadfast and they teach themselves through these networks of friendship, through these gatherings, how one really ought to think about God, to think about the divine, to think about religious ritual. What do we want from religious ritual, right? I want to give you an example to make this clear. One of the things that this religious supremacist, legal supremacist approach does to the study of Muslims is that you get the impression that Muslims do only things that they are required to do, not things that they're not required. Now, dua, spontaneous prayer, is one of the things that Muslims are not required to do. It's mustahab. It means that it makes you favored in the eyes of God, but you don't have to do it, right? It has no sanctions. And yet, of course, I never met a believing Muslim who says, I don't do dua. Well, it's not required, so why should I talk to God? Now, when I asked, having done a lot of research on ritual prayer, then I wanted to know about spontaneous, non-ritual, voluntary prayer. And it was very surprising to me because when I asked about dua, examples that they remembered of dua sessions that they haven't forgotten were sessions where they were angry with God, and they would say, this and this and this happened in my life. I became very upset at God. I couldn't understand why was God doing this to me. And then they would explain a dua session where they were actually scolding God and asking him to account for himself. Why are you putting me go through this? Now, what conception of God is this, right? If God is utterly across an ontological divide, right, has never given birth, nor has he been born, would you talk to God like that, right? So this was also eye-opening because if you only look at namaz, you don't really get a sense of the full way of the many different ways, of the different ways in which people talk to God and relate to God, which are quite different from, for example, what the clerics, the much more legalistic clerics close to the government would tell you to behave toward God, to have awe, to have fear, to pray because you're fearful that you might end up in hell. This is very far from that.
One of the things that also struck me with your narrative and with your research is that, and you and I were talking about this before we went live in the session, is, I was always struck by how much folks either within my family circle or wider circles, even folks who would outrightly say that they were not necessarily religious, were a part of these different kinds of nodas or circles or classes, and that it is a fairly widespread phenomenon. I think that that's important to state and to recognize, and even when we move to different generational manifestations of this, they take slightly different forms and they have different kinds of practices, but there is this very lively engagement with how do we make sense of our lives and our connection to any kind of spirituality or the divine in Iran. I think your work does this really beautifully. Alireza Dostar also focuses on this in a different way from an anthropological perspective, and I think goes to really complicate these these arguments that we might hear that the Islamic Republic has turned people off from religion, and instead really complicates this notion of what religion even means for people. And for me, you bring in this discussion quite a bit in your book, and I would just love to hear you talk about it a little bit more, which is the role of mass media and also in tandem, the vast cultural production behind prayer books, behind women writing things on spirituality and prayer, behind different understandings of the role of religion in our lives. And so the ways in which you talk about a mass literacy about religion in the post-revolutionary sphere because of the existence of the Islamic Republic and the ways it translates into different parts of people's lives. But also there's this really large mass media and cultural production wing of this too, which is also not always just from the state. There's lots of different ways. So I would just love to hear you talk a little bit more about that.
Sure. Most of these women, actually all of them, don't agree with the state's version of how it is, what it means to be a Muslim, how one should live as a Muslim. Nevertheless, they watch a fair amount of television because there is a range of, for example, talk shows where people are brought who have credibility, who have intellectual credibility among people who may not agree with the state's line about Islam. And so, as you said, there is a very wide range, not only in these poetry classes or on classes. And in parentheses, we should say that, Iranians who are not religious still lay claim to the mystic heritage that they have because they, for a variety of reasons, they see it differently as, Islam, with this very bounded kind of religious idea of what it is. So yes, so in these classes, you get a range of people who participate. And in the media, in the mass media, I was very interested to see that several of these women regularly watch programs that bring speakers who talk about Islam, who talk about mysticism, who talk about doing dua, who talk about praying and so on. And I remember that one of the other examples I give in terms of the role of mass media is that on Channel 4 in Iran, Shabake Chahar, they had invited Ebrahim Dinani, who is a rather popular, kind of beloved speaker, who talks about mysticism, talks about Irfan. And you see, you would not expect someone like that to be invited because actually the kinds of things he says do not toe the line. Now, these are networks that are controlled by the state, right? But you do get a range of speakers who have credibility and talk about things that, in fact, for example, one of the things Dinani talked about was how, about the Sufi dance, Sama. And then that became so controversial. That's another example I give where people were saying, how could he, how could a religious man sanction and say it's good to to do sama. You know, sama is forbidden, and then they rushed and asked tons of ayatollahs, what do you think about this? So mass media still has a role to play, even though to a large degree, like for example, television channels and radio stations are controlled. Now, with regard to cultural production, so, you know, at some point in my fieldwork, I was given 2 books by some of these women that were very beautifully produced, you know, very colorful, hardback, rather expensive. And one of them was called Tea with a Taste of God, Chai ba Ta'am Khoda. And so I became very interested to follow this. So I went to religious bookstores, especially in Qom, the shrine city close to Tehran. And I realized something that really caught my attention, which is that in the vast number of shelves they have on prayer, they also have prayer books produced by young men and women, especially women, which are written in this genre that's called simple Irfan in Iran, Irfan Saadi, and are very popular. And so what you realize is that the definition of what constitutes dua has expanded. It's not just, you know, a sort of Shia imam who wrote in Arabic and, you know, here's his dua. You can also have a dua in Persian written by a young university student who happens to be very fluent in this kind of poetic, you know, simple Irfan. And so, yeah, so there is a lot happening, for example, in the world of prayer books. And you have a really wide range. And as I try to show, the idea of what constitutes a prayer has really expanded.
Yeah, and reading this book now, and I know previously I had also mentioned this too, but reading this book in the time of Corona really made me yearn for the communal aspect of sitting and talking with people as we try to figure out what, you know, what's our place in the world and how do we sort of, what the hell can we do, and how do we relate to one another, and how do we relate to this world that feels so chaotic and out of control. And so I do want to ask you about the communal aspect of this, because you write about this quite a bit, and how important that communal aspect is. Yeah, so that's one question, and I have a sort of a follow-up for that, but I'll leave it at that for now.
Sure. Right. No, the communal aspect is very, very important for so many reasons. One of them is that, you know, outdoor places of entertainment have gotten curtailed. Women have to, if they go there, they have to appear in some kind of Islamic headscarf and things like that. And, you know, the traditional love of Iranians for gatherings, you know, they all have combined. And so what happens is there is a lot of sociality. For example, in either Quran or poetry classes, they were run in very similar ways. First of all, each week, 1 or 2 women agree to bring sweets, and then the host makes tea, and then there is, you know, a sweet and tea break, which of course everyone looks forward to. And then both in Quran and poetry classes, you have the teacher, for example, read 2 lines, and then the next person reads 2 lines, and then the next person reads 2 lines. So everyone participates. You know, it's very important to be able to play a role, an active role and you know, in Quran classes, it's very interesting because a lot of people come with different editions, different translations of the Quran. So when their translation does not match that of the teacher's translation, you end up with these really interesting hermeneutic debates about which translation is better, which translation is more apt. And this gives that feeling of being able to participate in a debate that is very important and that is larger than you, right? What does this verse of the Quran or what does this verse of Hafez mean? So the sociality is very important. And I remember one of the women who is quite active in going to these classes. And, you know, it's amazing, this commitment to go to classes. I mean, they have been going to these classes for decades, right? One of them said to me, you know, she actually is one of 2 or 3 women who had a master's. She got a master's in sociology from an American university, and then she went back to Iran. She said to me, you know, I'm aware that, you know, we don't have certain political rights in Iran. You know, freedom of speech is hard to come by, and so on and so forth. She said, but, you know, I feel a lot of freedom because I am able to take part in these classes and talk about what I want to talk about without censorship, really. These are the things I want to talk about. I want to understand what it is, you know, what is it, who is a true Muslim? And I say what I want. And I really enjoy this vitality. This vitality is really quite amazing. Now, I don't want to say that it only happens in Iran for some reason. It's just that I guess, you know, we're not quite used to, as social scientists, we're not quite used to seeing, documenting, theorizing the vitality as much as we should. Because then something happens and then we're all very surprised, right? Oh, wow, these people, we thought they really weren't doing anything. They weren't thinking about anything. And suddenly, oh, look, there's an uprising. How did that happen? Well, because you weren't maybe looking in the right place, right? Now, I want to say one thing about friendship, because that's also what is involved in these communal gatherings. Friendship is really crucial in the quality of religiosity of these women. To the point where, you know, it would not be correct to say that these women pray because the religion tells them to. Yes, that's true, but they also pray because their friends pray, because they love their mothers, and some of them say, well, I pray, my mother told me to pray, I pray, right? I mean, you hear these stories about the importance of friendship. You know, one of the oldest women, the oldest woman that I interviewed, she said that when my sister was going to pilgrimage, she said, I'm going to go to Hajj and ask God to help you start to pray again, because she had stopped praying. And she says to her with some anger, there is no need for you to ask God to do that. You ask me and I will do it. And then she said, you know, after that, I started praying again. Right. So, you know, there's a very nice line that Robert Orsi, who writes on Catholics in the US, has. He says, we are accompanied in this world. So while we might look at individuals, actually they are accompanied. We might not see the accompaniment, but they are really accompanied in this journey. Yeah.
That's beautiful. So I'm going to kind of combine this with some audience questions that we're getting, which is, you know, the folks are asking about the state, the ways in which the state clerical, I mean, I think sorry, okay, let me back up and rephrase this question, right? Oh. So the folks are asking about how state clerical seminaries in general, and especially those that produce folks who are very much in line with the establishment, how these discussions and debates that you're capturing in your book, how do these things align or not align, or how is it even that these things can coexist together? And since we're nearing the end of our time, I kind of want to tack in one of the final questions I had for you, because I think it relates, which is, what does this kind of public discussion and grappling with poetry and prayer together mean for the future of religion, politics, and society in Iran? You touch upon this a little bit in your conclusion, but I would love to hear you riff on it a little more, that what does this open up in general in Iranian society and on questions of politics and religion?
Okay. A tall order for about 4 minutes, but okay, so let me first answer the question with regard to clerical, with regard to seminaries, their discussions on how they align or not. So the first thing to say is that I did not study seminaries, but I did come across people who did attend them, and so I asked them certain questions. But I don't want to, speak as an expert on what's going on in seminaries. The other thing to note is that those who attend seminaries in Iran, and the most important one is the Qom seminary, they are not necessarily pro-state, pro-regime. Not necessarily. There is quite a lot of debate among them, and a lot of them are not pro-regime. So one shouldn't equate, seminaries with state clerics. Now, they have their own debates, and some of them do align with what is going on. In fact, for example, I just want to give you empirical examples because as I said, I didn't study seminaries, but I want to tell you what I did find that might be interesting in answering this question. I met one of the people who had attended seminaries for many years. I talked to him about the use of Persian versus Arabic with regard to formulas that you're supposed to use. For example, when someone gets married, the marriage contract, the marriage formula, the sighe, or let's say a space that is to become a mosque, you're supposed to say a formula. And so I asked him, have there been debates about whether these all have to be in Arabic or can they be in Persian? And all kinds of interesting answers came. One of them was that he said that Ayatollah Khomeini had said that the marriage contract can be read in Persian. Now, that's a very big change, the kind of orthodoxy that used to be that everything that has to do with Islam has to be in Arabic, especially when it comes to legal matters. So this was interesting to find out. And another thing that he told me, and this is all over, of course, I don't think it would surprise anyone, that, for example, they have teachers in seminaries for whom, say, Rumi is a very important figure in their formation, and others who think of Rumi as, like the Ayatollah Qarati said, as an anti-prophet. So also within seminaries, there are all kinds of debates, and I wish that it was a more open space so that one could find out more. But I suggest for anyone who reads Arabic or Persian to go to the website of the Qom Seminary. It's called Wikifiqh, and it's really, really interesting to see the many, you can see actually that debates are going on by the entries and by the content of the entries that they have on their website. It's called Wikifiqh. I highly recommend it. Unfortunately, it doesn't exist in English, but it's in Persian and Arabic. Now, going to your question, Nargis, about the future of religion and what does the coexistence of prayer and poetry open up, I think one of the most important things that it facilitates is an exploration of religion, of divinity, of what it means to be human, what it means to be a Muslim. What are the ethics of living in this world? Because, as you know, Persian classical poetry is full of discussions about the ethics of being with other people, the ethics of being a friend, the ethics of being a Muslim, the ethics of praying. And there are poets like Hafez who are actually obsessed with false piety, right? So rereading Hafez at this point is very important because you do come across false piety quite often in the public sphere, and people gain a particular vision of what it means to have false piety. I think a word like poetry allows a kind of airing and opening up of questions wider than they may have been open if you were to read simply only the Quran or only the Hadith, right? This plurality of sources that serve as inspiration for thinking, for theorization, for discussion is really crucial. Yeah, that's what I would say.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry that we're at the end of our hour because we could keep talking with you about this. But thank you, Professor Niloofar Haeri. I really encourage everyone to get this book. It really opens up a lot of avenues of thinking about post-revolutionary Iranian society.
Thank you so much again for the invitation.